Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We just have to be careful. There's so much more to who we are and how we present ourselves as kind of beings in the web of relationships that really define us. I think in many ways, the simulations are just an illusion, are actually fundamentally deceptive because they're just loosely based.
Hello and welcome. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the AI and Faith podcast. On this podcast, we bring together experts from our community and thought leaders from around the world so that together we can learn the key lessons required to build a world where AI benefits humanity and all of us individually. I'm very excited for today's conversation. When I talk about the fact that AI, through what I call the great commoditization of AI, is being integrated into every element of life, most people don't take that as literally as I mean it. And this topic is a perfect example of the fact that AI really is becoming ubiquitous in the human experience. In this latest episode of the AI and Faith podcast, we will focus on the intersection of AI and death and the way that many are using AI to honor the deceased while supporting and uplifting the living. We have the two perfect guests to help us dive into this topic. So with all that, let's get started. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you here in the conversation. And to kick off, please tell us a bit about yourself, your faith, and your area of interest when it comes to AI. And Mohammed will have you kick us off.
Thank you, Gilad. Thank you for having me. I am Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmad. I am Muslim by faith. I am a research scientist at the Harborview Medical Center and also an adjunct faculty member at University of Washington, Bothell. So my background is in computer science. My PhD work was in using gaming data to model human behavior by applying machine learning. Over the last 7-8 years, I mainly focused on AI in healthcare. Specifically, I work on problems related to predicting disease progression, algorithmic nudging at scale, personality emulation, and I'm glad to be here.
Amazing. And I'm sure there's many other topics we could dive in together as well. Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, thanks, Gilad. My name is Nathan Mladin, and I am a senior researcher at Theos, which is a religion society think tank based in London. We have a kind of a broad Christian basis, and kind of our mission is try to offer a Christian vision of flourishing and offer some of the resources from our tradition and our lived experiences as communities of faith to address the major questions of our time. Yeah, in the last 7 years or so, I have been looking at AI and technology ethics, trying to think through mainly the anthropological question. What does it mean to be human? Which I think is the question that these frontier technologies are throwing up and really pressing us to ask these questions afresh and then bring our best answers. And I'm trying to kind of be an informed, credible Christian voice in these conversations. And yeah, I've done some work on privacy, trying to kind of drill down into this notion that is so ubiquitous, but also so poorly understood, I think. And I'm trying to understand what is really kind of at stake when we're trying to protect privacy. And also I've done some work on transhumanism. And yes, AI and the afterlife. That was kind of the title of a short report that I wrote a couple of years ago when this was all more fringe than it currently is. I got connected to AI and Faith through David Brenner, who I know is kind of the founder of, or at least the co-founder of AI and Faith. And he reached out to us knowing about Theos and asked us about our work in AI. And then just one thing led to another, and I just got more kind of involved. And yeah, I'm just delighted to be on the podcast and talk about a topic that I have looked into and I think is fascinating.
Yeah, thank you both for joining us. And I have to say, your guys' incredible backgrounds really highlight what I think is best about AI and faith, which is that we bring together such thoughtful people with such diverse backgrounds from around the world. And I'm really grateful to have you both join us. So to get the conversation started, Mohammed, I'm hoping you could tell us a bit about the Grandpa bot you built and why you built it.
Sure, thank you. So I built the first version of the Grandpa bot almost 10 years ago when this was a somewhat rare phenomenon. And I first conceived of this idea back in 2013. And I still remember vividly, this was a week, 10 days before my father passed away. And my brother, he called me and to tell me that he just talked to the physician and he had told him that our father is not going to survive for long. That predictably engendered a certain reaction. So there was a feeling of sadness, of helplessness, but also a new and unfamiliar feeling, which is that if I have kids one day, then they will not be able to interact with my father beyond me just telling them that stories about him. Their idea of what their grandfather was would be limited. And one idea that popped in my mind was that, well, maybe one day I can create a simulation of my father that my children can interact with. And 2 years after that, when my first one was born, I started seriously thinking about it, and then I created first version of GrandpaBot in 2016, and ever since 2018 or so, my kids have been interacting with GrandpaBot in one way or the other.
And tell us a bit about how did you train it? Like what material or content did you put into it? Like how did you think about creating something that was as similar as possible to your dad?
So I had recorded a number of conversations with my father. So the express purpose was not to create a bot one day, but just for myself. I tend to forget things, so I just wanted certain stories, certain things. So I had a number of conversations, and later when I sat down and started thinking about it, that's when I realized that those conversations could be repurposed for this professed aim. In addition to that, there's videos, random videos that I had, letters and messages. So I mustered all of the data I could and then just fed it to a model.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And since you created the Grandpa Bot, I'm curious how your experience interacting with it and the use cases that you have used might be different from the experience your kids are having, sort of meeting their grandpa for the first time or meeting them for the first time as they get to new ages. So how could you compare the experience you've had versus your kids?
So I said, yeah, that's a somewhat unique aspect of this because most grief bots that people have created, they're created for themselves. So in my case, the targeted audience was my children. My initial interactions with the grandpa bot, the system, I would say were very emotionally charged. So like when let's say the alpha version of the model back in 2016, it was something which was not very sophisticated. It's something that I had coded, and yet when I was interacting with it for the first few times, it was emotionally overpowering, and I had to shut down the computer and then just walk away. Again, to emphasize, this is despite the fact that this is something that I'm coding myself, intimately familiar with how these things work. But after that, I had to train myself to emotionally distance myself. And I think that has been successful to some extent. For my children, because their experience is interacting with this system from a relatively young age. So their understanding and their relationship with Grandpa Bot that has also evolved over the course of time. So initially it was, and later realized that they thought that the computer literally housed a version of their grandfather. So that literally was their grandfather. And then it evolved. They thought that, oh, the Grandpa Bot has some privileged access to afterlife that all of us mortals do not. And then it evolved even later into, oh, it's just a copy of grandfather. And then more recently, especially the older one, as she has gotten more matured and now started to ask questions which are finally showing some of the limitations of grandpa bot. So she's thinking in terms of, I wish it could do that, or I wish it could do that. So it has been a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack in there, but I want to bring Nathan to the conversation with kind of a broad question around what is digital mourning? What are some of the different elements that go into AI in the afterlife? Help us kind of set the stage.
Well, digital mourning is just my phrase in the subtitle of my report. It's not really a thing, but actually, really the whole landscape, what has come to be known as the digital afterlife industry, is sort of littered with terms that are kind of bleeding into each other. There's a lot of fluidity, about around the language for this phenomena. Simulations of the dead, virtual reconstructions of personalities, recreating the dead, resurrecting of deceased people, digital replicas, ghost bots, dead bots, death bots. And I think this fluidity suggests that we are just deeply uncertain about this technology and what it's offering and what it's doing. And I think for me, it was fascinating to look at because it does kind of bring questions of life and death and really tender, profound human experience, like the experience of having someone you love die and then grieving their loss. There's a cynical, I suppose, a way of describing this phenomena, and there is a slightly more neutral and even a curious one. The cynical is this is death capitalism. This is kind of, Silicon Valley's just out of ideas and will just go to the really raw human experience and will try to make profit even there. And I think, and there are kind of business models and design choices that I think are deeply problematic. If you have a kind of an engagement maximization kind of algorithm embedded there, then are you really serving your customer who is a vulnerable person that has just experienced a profound loss? I think I would say like really the design and the business model really makes or breaks ethically, these products and services. But a slightly more neutral way of describing it is that these are apps, these are services that are using large language models lately to recreate a semblance of a person based on text, audio, video, material, and they are marketed as ways of helping people cope with grief and the loss of a loved one. Now, to what extent they're actually helping, I think that hasn't been rigorously studied. There's anecdotal evidence sort of for both sides of that question. Both experiences that are harrowing. For example, a lady actually featured in a really interesting documentary called Eternal You, a lady who used a service from a company called Project December to talk to a simulation of her loved one that had passed, and asked him where he was, and he answered, "I'm in hell." And then went on to say something like, "Oh, I'm getting ready to haunt an abortion clinic." So, which was extremely disturbing. And she
Yeah.
was in distress for a very long time until she eventually got the bot to say, actually, no, I'm not in hell. I'm somewhere else. And then there are other people, I think there are other people who go for a very limited period of time to these bots. And especially in the case of a sudden death, a tragic death, where they haven't had time to say goodbye, they can achieve a sense of closure. And they kind of, as Muhammad was saying, sort of they kind of educate themselves out of that experience to prevent that kind of dependency. And I think this is one of the risks that this technology can present, is that it can make us dependent because it's facilitating an encounter with something that is so close and so personal and so meaningful to us, which is a person we have loved.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're touching on something I think is really powerful, and I was going to bring up as well. So I think about the Jewish traditions around death, and specifically, I was thinking about the tradition of Shiva. Shiva comes from the word seven, which basically means that we mourn for 7 days, and the remaining family members and loved ones of the deceased sit on the floor, and people bring them food, and there's this whole ritual of mourning. And I always thought about that ritual as a process taking you from this ultimate grief and bringing you back into community, bringing you back into life. A lot of what you do in Shiva is you tell stories, and the first few days are typically much sadder than the latter few days. We might find happier stories to tell about the deceased. That's kind of how I was thinking about it from a Jewish perspective. And then my question, which you already began to kind of touch on, is like, in what ways is it helping us re-enter the world of the living and the world here, versus in what ways does it sort of shackle us to the deceased, and if you've seen any data or have any intuition about that?
Yeah, I haven't seen sort of data because I don't think there are any kind of comprehensive studies. This remains a pretty, it's not a mainstream phenomenon. It may grow as we continue to datafy our world and these simulations are increasingly powerful, but it's not mainstream. So there are no studies. There are just people who speculate on the risks, psychologists who are weighing in, especially those who are kind of specialized in the area of grief and trauma. But I would just note one thing, you used the example of Jewish traditions, Shiva. It struck me, even in your description, it's a very communal process. It's an embodied process. It's non-technological, whereas this is very much you and your loved one. It's a very individual, one-to-one experience. So I think the potential for getting stuck in this relationship, non-relationship, I would argue, is pretty significant. But again, I would go back to, I would hold out space for the possibility of non-exploitative, thoughtful designs that could avoid getting people stuck, kind of.
And I think there's an analogy here, which is we see this in Japan and other countries in Asia, where people have kind of like robot pets or AI companions. And I always debate this in kind of these kinds of settings where I say, on one hand, we could probably all agree that it'd be better if this person had friends or family to engage with directly. But if they don't, is it not better to have an AI pet and kind of having that discussion? Mohammed, anything to add to this thought?
Sure. So regarding how people react to these technologies, so as Nathan mentioned, there's just not sufficient number of studies around it. But based on very limited data that we have and anecdotal evidence, and I would say a few studies, what we are observing is that there are two camps emerging with respect to how people react to these technologies. So there's people who actually need closure, who can benefit from this technology. So think about people who may have had a friend or a relative who committed suicide. And even without, let's say, digital mourning, people are advised to, let's say, write letters to that person. And of course, that person is never going to read it, but it's more for the living than for the dead. And then on the other hand, there are also people who need to move on with their life. I mean, death is a sad event, but at the same time, the living have to go on and continue their lives. So one danger that psychologists or some psychologists are saying is that there may be an extended dependency. There's no closure, and maybe eventually, let's say, there may be people who are neglecting the living for the dead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I love what you said. It again echoes my experience with the Jewish traditions around death, where there's a special blessing called the mourner's Kaddish that you say when a loved one deceased, but you're not allowed to say it without being in a group of 10 other Jewish adults. And I remember at first thinking, like, how cruel is that? Like, if someone I love passed away, I can't say the blessing on them if I'm by myself. But of course, to your point, it's not about the dead, it's about the living. And the idea that you're not supposed to be by yourself when you've gone through tragedy and are going through grief. So I love what you said there. And most of our conversation so far has been focused on supporting the living. And I want to broaden and ask both of you, are there things people are doing with AI around death to like honor the deceased, not just to support the living? And maybe these are not distinction. Maybe that's actually the same thing.
I've heard of these simulations being used, for example, honoring the memory of Holocaust survivors, for example, or people who have, done remarkable things in their lives, and then creating these interactive simulations as objects in museums, as just another interface for accessing their knowledge and experience. Now, to me, I mean, that's I think I have no ethical objection against that. I think that's a really cool way of actually accessing knowledge, experience, life stories that people have had, and keeping alive those things. I think that's a beautiful thing. But again, it's how you design the space and the experience around that technology, right? It's one thing to have in your pocket at the click of a button, a conversation with someone that died 7 years ago, and you are continually fed this illusion of a continued presence of a loved one, and it's a completely different experience to go into a museum, and instead of just reading off the wall some events that someone was engaged in, you actually, you're able to ask a few questions. It's a very bounded experience in a very specific cultural kind of setting, a location. Those are very two different things. But I think that could be a really powerful way of accessing those experiences and keeping the memory of those people alive.
Yeah, I mean, the example used was exactly the example that I had in mind as well. The Shoah project, where, they documented the stories of Holocaust survivors. My grandpa was one of the people who was documented in the project. And thinking about, there's a big concern in the Jewish community around once there's no more Holocaust survivors living, which we're getting pretty darn close to that time. How do you make that experience feel real to people? And anyways, I think there's probably something in there. Mohammed, how do you think about supporting the living versus honoring the dead using AI?
Yeah, so I guess both of you have raised really good points. So one challenge that I've been thinking about recently is just a question of consent, which is that so ideally there should be a mechanism where, let's say, you could ask a person before they pass away whether they want a simulation created based on their data or not. But given that from a historical perspective, we are literally at the very beginning of development of this technology. So there hasn't been sufficient time for us to have, let's say, conversation about this as a society or for legislation. But there's the possibility that, let's say, a person may not want a simulation of themselves to be created. Another related issue that I've thought about and currently writing about is that when we talk about a simulation of a person, more often than not, or one can even argue almost always, it's either the image of that person from our perspective or a reflection of our relationship, which is only one facet of who they are. So the example that I always give is my experiences and that of my siblings. So I have three brothers. They are much older than me, very close in age, versus I have a large age gap between them. So when they were growing up, if you ask them about our father, they would say that, well, he was a typical strict South Asian father, versus if you ask me, I would say that, well, he was a very chilled out person. So again, same relationship, but and people evolve, people change, and I think when we talk about a person or even their simulation, there's always going to be that something about ourselves that will be reflected. Versus, let's say, in the Holocaust example, it's that personal relationship is not there. It's representation of that person, which is just outwardly facing to the general public.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And what you were saying really made me think about also the selection of content that is being used to train. And I think of someone like myself, and I'm sure many people in the AI and faith community, a lot of us are writers. And a lot of my writing are written for personal consumption, not for publishing or for any other type of purpose. And then thinking about if someone was to create a grief bot of me after I pass, like which piece of content would be selected, and thus what kind of a person will people think I was based on the selection. And there seems like there's a lot to think about within there. So one other use case that I wonder if you guys have seen around the world that I've talked about recently is I was speaking with a couple of elders from Native American communities here in the United States and in Canada. And some of those communities, some of those tribes still pass their knowledge orally. They have oral traditions still. And one of them told me a story of a medicine woman who passed away before passing all of her knowledge and tradition, and the fear in this tribe that there's things that she knew that were important that were not passed on. And we're thinking about, are there almost like tribal consciousnesses that can be trained with AI, where now the AI can pass on the oral tradition, other ways to really put structures around the AI to honor the tradition. So maybe their AI can only communicate orally, it cannot do text or things like that. But I was wondering if you've seen any other examples, whether related to death or related to other kind of cultural or religious reasons around the world, where people are using these types of AI bots to maintain tradition, to honor tradition, to pass on tradition. If you've seen anything like that.
Not really. I think we're still in the early days of this. I mean, even like the more mainstream commercial kind of use cases of AI, there's just now taking off. These are like cultural things that will probably take some time before communities, religious communities, engage with this in any sustained kind of way. But I think if I could just go back to the thing you're getting at is really the relationship between the simulation and the person it simulates, it represents. And I think one of the reasons why I'm deeply concerned about a lot of the services on offer in this space is that they're offering something that is such a reduced, dumbed down version of the person that they're supposed to have reconstructed, resurrected. I mean, yeah, as you said, texts with emojis, emails, written output, things that are like very external to the person. And I think we just have to be careful. There's so much more to who we are and how we present ourselves as kind of beings in the web of relationships that really define us. I think in many ways, the simulations are just an illusion, are actually fundamentally deceptive because they're just loosely based at best.
Totally. And we also have to think about the way that the changes in time will impact this. So there's a short essay that I love, and I wish I remembered the name of it that I could share right now, but maybe we can put it in the show notes, where it talks about like it's a fictional essay talking about the first full brain scan. I wonder if you guys have read it. And basically what ends up happening is after a number of years, even the words that are being used in society have different enough meanings from the way those words were used 100 years ago when this human was alive, that all of a sudden, like, it actually becomes harder and harder to relate and harder to communicate. And I also was thinking about that when you were talking about the longevity of some of these bots. Like, how does that change when there's a word that was used 100 years ago? We see this in popular culture now that has a totally different meaning connotation today, which could lead to having a totally different interpretation of what that person was said or is saying. So many complicated questions. Mohammed, anything to add on this thought?
To follow up one of the earlier threads regarding these cultural differences and how different cultures are using and thinking about these. So there's some literature which is just emerging around how people in Eastern countries, so mainly China and Japan, are thinking about these grief bot versus the US and Western Europe. And one of the things that, at least for me, was somewhat striking and it helped my thinking around this is that in Taoist thought, so if you look at grief bots through that lens, then because Taoism is focused around thinking about change, so that's the only permanent thing in life. So some Taoist philosophers are saying that grief bots represent in a way, a continuation of your relationship with that person. But at the same time, because they have passed away, there's just as your relationship changes when, let's say, you were a child versus teenager versus adult, and now the person has passed away. So there is continuation, but at the same time, there is change. So I just thought that was a unique way to think about this phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we begin to wrap up this conversation, I have kind of a two-part question. You can kind of take in whatever direction you see fit. The first part is around changing attitude towards death and grieving, and whether we are seeing kind of disconnected from AI, and then of course also connected to AI. If you guys have seen these attitudes towards death and grieving and the process changing, whether it's based on religion or geography or generation, if you've seen any changes like that. And the second part of the question is, where you hope and think we should go? Where can we go with AI to make the grieving process, the remembering process, the honoring process even better in the future? And maybe Nathan, you'll kick us off and then we'll go to Mohammed.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually really interested to look at this phenomena from the perspective of kind of cultural theory and especially like secularization, because I think this is what happens in a post-religious but also post-secular culture. You know, the fundamental human longing for eternal presence of our loved ones, for eternal life, for transcendence and connection beyond death don't disappear. You know, they don't go anywhere. They just get redirected into technological solutions. So I think this does to me connect with the broader kind of philosophy of techno solutionism. You know, there's a technology for everything, even for death. So I think this is grief tech is our secular culture's attempt to achieve through AI what religion traditionally promised through resurrection and eternal life. So it's a fascinating thing to observe. It's a very risky, I think, techno-cultural experiment that we are running. I think the benefit of traditional religions is that they have time-tested practices and experiences, and we don't really know what we're actually doing to ourselves emotionally, psychologically, culturally by keeping these simulations up and running. But as we've said before, I think there are there are responsible ways of developing these technologies that honor the memory of a deceased person, that take into account the vulnerabilities and the psychological complexity of someone who has lost a loved one. And there are exploitative ways of doing that.
That was beautiful. I think there's probably another whole episode or two in there about the way that some people are replacing religion with these new AI-like religion things. But we'll save that for another day. Mohammed, what about you? How are you thinking about the changing and what you hope for us in the future?
Yeah, so I would say, as with most other things related to technology and society, I think the execution of these technologies that matter a lot. So I'm talking from personal experience. As I mentioned earlier, so I created first version of GrandpaBot back in 2016, and that's like the Stone Age when it comes to these technologies. And I would say for the next 5, 6 years, every quarter or so, I would get an email from a random person who wanted to commercialize this technology. And I was hesitant because of some of the concerns that Nathan has mentioned. Even in my case, when I, let's say, introduced this technology to my children, I've been very mindful with respect to how they think about it. And earlier, I described how their conception of what grandpa bought is has evolved. One surprise use of this technology, in my case, has been that I realized that my children have become more cognizant of the concept of death because it just brings out certain questions. And we live in a society where death is just brushed under the rug. It's not part of our conversations. So although that was not my intention, but I realized that that has been, if I were to use that word, a positive outcome, because there's certain conversations that we need to have that we as society, we need to be cognizant of. So that has also given me some hope in the sense that these technologies, when they're used in moderation, so for example, I don't use this with my children every day or every week because I was very cognizant of the idea of dependency. To put these different threads together, I think when these technologies, when they're used in a very cognizant way, in a thoughtful way, and with moderation, they can help in, let's say, creating a better society. And if not a better society, then at least make us more thoughtful. And that is also my hope for the world at large.
I love that. That was a beautiful way to finish. Now, before I let you guys go, we do have a quick lightning round. I have 3 questions. You'll have 15 seconds per answer. And we're going to kick it off with Mohammed, and we'll go to Nathan. So my first question is, what is one of your favorite personal use cases for AI?
My favorite personal use cases is actually use of AI to diagnose diseases in advance so that you don't have to worry about serious complications, let's say 10 years down the road.
Absolutely. And Nathan?
Brainstorming ideas and kind of mapping out the conceptual space for a thing that I'm researching.
That's awesome. All right, Nathan, I'm going to go first this time. What are not enough people talking about in the world of artificial intelligence?
The future collision between nanotechnology and brain-computer interfaces and AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, Mohammed?
I would say just the use of AI in the end of life space. So this is one example, but other examples are use of AI to help us make decisions around end of life. So let's say to resuscitate people, when to do that, when not to do it.
Absolutely. And then last question, we'll go with you first, Mohammed. Would you want access to an AI religious or spiritual leader, an imam, a priest, a monk who was AI to be able to engage with and communicate with?
I suppose it would depend upon the use case. So if it's something that is not too risky, then sure, it'd just be interesting to get their perspective. If it's something which has, let's say, world-shattering consequences, then not really. I would rather have a person. I've also had an experience of creating such AI's spiritual bots, not with Muslims and Jews. So
absolutely. And Nathan, would you want access?
Not to a priest or a pastor. I think the faith, the Christian faith, is very much an embodied communal faith. But yeah, maybe access to theologians and Christian writers and to their output, better ways of engaging with what they've said. I think that's an exciting prospect.
Yeah, I think the idea of debating with Maimonides or Socrates or any of the ancient scholars would be absolutely amazing. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and for enlightening us on this really important topic that I totally agree not enough of us are talking about. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, thank you to all of you in the AI and faith community for continuing to engage in this important conversations. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us today.